Welcome back, everyone. If you've been following along up to this point, then you know that we've started to introduce this programming language called C. We looked at a simple Hello World program, and then we learned how we can compile and run our code using the GCC compiler. After that, we learned about header files and libraries, and how we can include them in our code so that we have access to the functions they provide. In that video, I said that we would be utilizing much of the standard C library, but we would also be utilizing a third-party library to help us better understand this language. We then looked at variables and data types, and learned how we can define variables using some of these built-in primitive data types. In this video, we're going to be installing one of these third-party libraries, which will give us the ability to get input from the user. We'll start by getting this library installed on our Ubuntu virtual machine, and then look at the functions defined in this library. After that, we'll do some examples so that you fully understand this. So here I am in my Ubuntu virtual machine, and the first thing we need to do, as usual, is to open up the terminal. Now we only need to run 3 commands to get this library installed. The first thing we need is a tool called curl, which is going to go and find this library on the internet and download it for us. To install this tool called curl, we simply type sudo apt install curl and hit enter. We'll be prompted for a password, so let's enter that. And then you can see this tool is going to start to download. Next, we'll run this somewhat long command, which will go out to the internet and download the requirements for this library. I'll paste this in, and I'll also paste this in the description so you can copy and paste it yourself. If you're used to Windows or Mac, you might try to use Ctrl-V to paste this in the terminal. However, in Linux, we need to use Shift-Control-V. If that still doesn't work, you may need to come up here to Devices and Shared Clipboard and make sure this is set to bidirectional. I'm going to go ahead and run this command and let it start to download. The final command that we're going to need to run is going to install this library onto our virtual machine. So we're going to run sudo apt install libcs50 and hit enter. And now once this is complete, we'll be able to include this library in our code using the hashtag include followed by cs50.h. Now I want to be clear that this library that we're going to be using is only temporary. Eventually I'll wean you off of this library, but the whole purpose of using it is to help perform user input, which is a very common operation. However, in C, there are some higher level concepts that you need to understand before taking user input without the help of a library like this. And if you're an experienced C programmer, then you might spot a few white lies, but rest assured that in due time, we'll phase this library out and implement the same concepts with just C. So now that we have this library installed, let's take a look at some of the functions that we're going to have at our disposal. I'll bring back this list of common data types because you'll find that the functions in this library map very closely to these data types. So with this library, we're going to get a function called getChar. And this function is going to help us get a character from the user. We're going to have another one called getInt. We'll have one called getFloat, getLong, getDouble, and getString. And all of these functions are designed to get input from the user, depending on the data type that you want to take as input. We're going to have the ability to get a char using getChar, the ability to get an int using getInt. And these functions are going to take as input a string that you want to prompt the user with. For example, if we wanted to ask someone their age, which would be a whole number or an integer, we could use the following. Get int, and then in these parentheses, we pass a string, the string that we want to prompt the user with. And this function is going to prompt the user to enter their age, and then pause the execution of the program, and wait for the user to enter a number. But most of the time, we're going to want to do something with the number they entered. So usually we'll store the quote-unquote return value in a variable. And as it turns out, these get functions will essentially hand you back a value, the value that the user entered. And to do this, we would first define an integer variable using int, and we'll call it age, because we're getting the age from the user. And then we'll assign this variable the value of getInt. And this is how we would prompt the user for their age, and then store that value in the computer's memory via a variable. You can think of this as reading from right to the left. The function getInt is going to prompt the user for their age, and then wait for them to enter it. Then this function will return or hand you back that value. So if the user enters 21, for example, you're going to get essentially the same thing as int age is equal to 21. 21 is the so-called return value of the function if the user enters 21. So when functions get executed, they can either perform some kind of side effect or operations like printing to the screen, or they can return a value. And as you can see with getInt, we're kind of doing both. We're performing a side effect by printing to the screen, enter your age, and then it halts program execution, which technically is another operation or side effect. And then finally, it will take the user's input and hand it back to us or return the value to us. We'll talk much more in depth about functions in the future, but this is how we're going to be using these get functions. Let's try each one of these to get a feel for using them, and then we'll see how we can print out the return value of each one. So I'll open this terminal back up, and I'll change directory into my tutorials directory, and then I'll use code, space, and a period to open the VS Code in this directory. Let me go ahead and maximize this. I'll close out of this Get Starting tab, and we'll start a new file, and we'll name this example.c. And in here, I'm going to do my normal boilerplate of hash include stdio.h int main void curly bracket return 0. And now let's go ahead and include this CS50 library so that we have access to these functions. And it's best practice to keep these header files in alphabetical order just for aesthetics. So we'll include the CS50 up at the very top. We'll do hash include cs50.h. So let's say that we're keeping track of some information about a student. For example, the first thing we would need to do is to prompt the user for their name. And we could do that by using the getString function. And we'll store the return value into a variable called name. So the return value is going to be a string, and the name of the variable is going to just be name. And we're going to assign this variable the value that's going to come back from getString. And we're just going to prompt the user for their name. And what about age? We could get the user's age by prompting them to enter their age. And age is an integer, so our return value is going to be an int. And we'll call this variable age. We're going to assign this the return value of getInt and prompt the user for their age. And how about a grade? like a school grade, like in our example from the last video. Well, grade would be a char or character. We'll name this grade, and we'll use get char this time and prompt the user for their grade. And we could also do the same thing for their birth date, for example. And this one might trick you up a little bit because birth date, you would think numbers, right? But actually birth dates sometimes have dashes or slashes. And generally we would represent these using a string. So again, we'll do string, birth date, and we'll get string and prompt the user for their birth date. Now that we've used these functions, let's compile and run this and see exactly what these are going to do. Alright, so let's save this and we'll open up our terminal and we'll compile this like normal with gcc -o example.c. And you can see here that we're getting an error. And this is what's called a linking error. As it turns out, the compiler knows where it can find on the hard drive the header files for the standard C library. However, with third-party libraries, it just doesn't know where to find it. And we have to tell it by doing what's called linking. And all we have to do is supply another input to GCC. In the case of this library, the argument we have to supply is -l cs50. We can get around this by doing what's called setting an environment variable. However, unless there's a video request on it, I won't be covering that. So let's just try gcc -o example.c and then -l cs50. And now you can see we get no errors. So let's try running this with /example, and we're being prompted for a name. So I'll enter a name of Chris, and now we're getting prompted for an age. I'll enter 21, and now we're getting prompted for an grade. So I'll give myself an A, and how about a birth date? So we'll just do 1-1-2020. And you can see after we give all the inputs, our program just exits. So now we probably want to do something with these values. Like maybe for now, just say something like hello Chris if the user enters Chris as their name. Or hello Bob if the user enters Bob as their name. And this is where format codes are going to come into play. And these format codes, again, map easily to these data types. So I'll bring back this list of data types just so that you can see it. Now, these format codes are what the printf function is going to use to allow us to format our text. We'll see some examples of this, so don't worry if this isn't clicking right away. But these are the format codes that we have at our disposal. And although they look strange, you can see that they map to each of these data types. For example, char is %c, integer is %i, float is %f, string is %s, and the only one that's a little different is the long format code, which is li for long integer. And these format codes are just a special symbol that printf will use as a placeholder. So let's see this in action. I'm back in that same program that we wrote of example.c, and we're only going to be using this name variable for now, so I'm going to go ahead and delete these other three. And now what I want to do is print out hello followed by the name that the user enters. And so how would I do that? You might think that I could do something like printf and then hello and name. And it's reasonable to assume that this might print out the variable name. However, what we know about printf thus far, I would argue that this is going to print out exactly this string hello name. And if we wanted to print out hello followed by the variable name, we would use this %s format code in place of this name inside our quotes. So I'll do hello %s, and now we need to tell printf what variable we want to place right there. And we do this by separating these by a comma, and we just type in name. So we're passing two arguments to the printf function. The first is the string hello %s with our format code in there, and the second is this variable name. And printf is going to know to take this name variable and place it where this placeholder is. And now when we run this, printf is going to replace the %s with the actual value of name, which will be inputted by the user. Let's compile and run this to prove this much. We need to make sure that we save this first, and then we'll open a terminal. And a little tip is that you can use the up and down arrow keys on your keyboard to scroll through the previous commands that you've run. So we'll scroll up twice to this compiling command, and we'll hit enter. And then we'll scroll up again twice to get to where we ran the code. And we'll enter a name like Chris. And as you can see, our program prints out hello followed by Chris. And we can run this again, and this time we'll type Bob, and this time it says hello Bob. But you can see that we didn't add that \n, so it didn't put our prompt to the next line. So let's go back in here, and right at the end of our string, we'll put that \n in. We'll save this, go back to the terminal, up on the arrow pad twice to get back to our compile command, run that, and then run our program again, and this time I'll type Sam. And you can see we get hello Sam, and the cursor goes to the next line. And we can use more than one of these placeholders with printf. So for example, if I wanted to get the first name for somebody, I could call this variable first name. And then let's get their last name too. So we'll type string last name, and we'll use getString, and we'll get the last name. And up here we should probably prompt them for their first name. Okay, so now we're going to be prompting the user for a first name and a last name. And then down in here in our print statement, we're going to say hello %s space and then another %s. And we're going to pass the first name, and then separate these by commas, and we're going to pass the last name. And now if I save this, come back to my terminal, we'll recompile and rerun this. We're prompted for a first name, so I'll say Sam, and a last name, Smith. And now you can see it prints out hello Sam Smith. And printf knows that these variables that you're passing will be placed in order from left to right. First name in the first %s, last name in the second %s. And these variables don't have to be the same data type. For example, I could do another one down here, and I can say int age equals getInt, and prompt the user for an age. And now down here, if I want to say something like, hello, first name, last name, you are so-and-so years old, and place that age in there. I can use %i, and then say years old. And now I just need to pass this age variable along. I'll separate it by comma and put age. And printf is going to know that first name goes in this first %s, last name goes in this second %s, and age goes in this %i, because that's the order that we gave it to them. So I'll save this, come back to the terminal, recompile, rerun, enter first name, Sam, last name Smith, and age 21, and you can see it says, hello Sam Smith, you are 21 years old. So that's really it for format codes. And again, this is a subset of all the format codes in C. You may run into reasons for using other ones later, but a simple Google search will give you a list of all the format codes you need. I'll stipulate though that these are the most common ones that you'll see and use, at least for now, while you're still learning this language. So to summarize, we saw how we can use a tool called curl to download this third-party library, and then we installed it on our virtual machine. We learned that to include it in our file, we have to use the #include preprocessor directive, followed by the cs50.h header file. And that will get us a few functions that'll help get input from the user. We saw some examples of these, and we saw how we can store the return value in variables so that we can use that later in our code. And we did use them later in our code when we introduced format codes so that we can format our text with printf. Now, I suggest you take some time to actually play around with these simple operations that we've discussed and get the hang of actually typing these out and getting random input from the user and printing it out in a formatted way using these format codes as placeholders. In the next video, we're going to look at conditionals, these forks in the road, so to speak, that will let us do one thing or another depending on some condition. Now, I hope you got some value out of this video, and if you did, make sure you hit the thumbs up so that I know you want to see more content like this in the future. If there are any questions or suggestions, please leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them in a timely manner. Also, keep your eyes open for a channel Discord to be coming very soon so that anyone interested has a place to go and talk with other people that are learning along with them. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.